Whew, okie dokie. Well,
All right. So here we
yeah,
are, following Pig's Blood Blues. We're now here to tread the boards, right? We're here to
right. Treading the boards. Absolutely, we
get some
are.
grease paint on, and
I mean, it's totally apropos to describe it in these terms as well, because Barker does this in the story, right?
yeah,
All the
yeah,
way through, all of the characters use theatrical metaphors all the time.
yeah.
And
And
the
it's
story itself also uses theatrical metaphors all the time and uses theatrical language and structure and kind of almost sets itself up as a strange postmodern, not parody, but almost of sort of like classical plays.
yeah. One of the things I found interesting, I read it through twice today, and the second time through, I was watching to see. I had a notion after the first read through that it may, in fact, the entire thing may, in fact, be set inside the walls of the theatre. It isn't quite.
Not quite.
There is exactly one scene that takes place outside, which is, I mean, a cut scene is the best way I can describe it.
Yes. Yeah. It's one of those odd things we've been talking about where Barker cuts away from the main action.
Yeah.
And in this instance, he's not head hopping because he actually leaps outside of the heads and becomes omniscient, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, it reminded me of elements of Stephen King, especially It, where there are moments in It where King will take that omniscient view. He'll take a pulled back stance. Typically, in that novel, when King does it, it's almost like he does it almost as an introduction or an interjection. It's like Rod Serling, like with his cigarette, or something. Rod Serling with a cigarette, you know, like there's the one I always remember is the start of adult Eddie's chapter where he says, you know, if you want to get, they say, if you really want to get an idea of the psychology of the American family in the latter half of the 20th century, take a look in their medicine cabinet. Well, dear God, take a look at Eddie's. You know,
it's a risky move, right?
It's very risky. It's
a risky move because you are deliberately revealing the artifice of what you're doing. You're revealing the artifice of the story. You are literally telling the reader this is a story when you do that.
Well, to use another theatrical device or phrase, you're shattering the fourth wall, right?
Exactly right. You're raising the curtain. Yeah, you're taking the masks off, and the lights are going on and showing you how contrived all of this is. I can't help but think, given the general intelligence not only of this story but of all of these stories in the Books of Blood, that it's deliberate.
No, absolutely.
It's what he's doing, right? And it's the fact that the players don't know what's going on. They're still immersed in their rather banal existence and just putting on this, what they generally consider to be a fairly lackluster performance, you know?
Yeah.
And there's something vast and mythological going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really interesting, and this I couldn't quite get a handle on because it didn't occur to me until after the second read. I'm almost certain it does break down, I think, into 3 acts.
Yeah.
Although I'm not sure I could place the breaks without one more read through to pick them out, but it feels like it does quite naturally.
Yeah.
And I think the first pivot point from Act 1 to Act 2 is when I think for the first act, you could almost read it as being a kind of a very sarcastic, a very snide kind of almost vicious insiders kind of critique of theatre and theatre culture, right? And it's quite scathing.
It's quite first act. Bitchy, isn't it? There's a tone to this one that's actually far removed from everything we've had before. We've had sort of comedic stories already. We've had the Yattering and Jack, but that has a sort of farcical nature to it. And being farce, it actually plays itself quite straight for the most part. This doesn't. This is immediate, almost like satirical writing, right? There's an arch satire to the writing here and a queenie bitchiness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't help but feel that this was in part informed by Barker's own early experiences in theatre.
Definitely, because it's his first love, right? It's his first love.
Absolutely.
This is theatre's where he began, really. He used to put on little self-written plays when he was at school with Doug Bradley and Pete Atkins, you know, when he was a high school student. And what I don't know if they had A-levels back then, but whatever the equivalent was back then.
Yeah.
And then when they all moved down to London, they used their dole money to create the Dog Company, which was their theatre company. And they would put on these by all accounts, very, very strange, oddly reliant on sort of practical physical effects theatre pieces.
And that's really interesting, isn't it? Because obviously then it represents in a lot of ways Barker's first blush with artistry, right? His first attempt to define himself as an artist or to find a way to express himself artistically.
And so it's very interesting. I mean, it is bitchy and it is snide often, and it really does sort of rake the muck of the politics behind the theatre curtain, right? Where you've got like the one-upmanship between the actors, you've got the pervasiveness of a particular type of queer culture as well, because it's absolutely true, particularly in the 1980s, that like theatre was dominated by queer people. It just was, there's nothing to be done about that. That's absolutely true. The divisions in roles between like the director, the person putting up the money, the actors, and all of that stuff is all here. But it's also, no matter how snide and bitchy it gets, and it gets quite excoriating, it's also very loving as well.
Well, that's the thing, is that it pivots at a certain point, and again, I feel that's where the first act break comes in. For the first act, it could be read as a straight kind of like a bitchy low rent version of 42nd Street, right? Mm-hmm. Which is this kind of. I mean, 42nd Street is very interesting because 42nd Street is actually very bitchy as well, but it is also ultimately it's a love note to that form of theatre. And interestingly, of course, when it was made, it was a love note to what was then a contemporary form of theatre. It was cinema complementing a form of theatre, which in itself is kind of really interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? Because you've got almost the opposite happening here. There is also another thing that happens in this story is you get Barker's critique on capitalist or materialist postmodernity. There's as well as it being an examination of theatre, it's also an examination of TV, right?
Yeah.
Of popular means of artistry and expression, which Barker, in this vein, at this point in his life, has no time for. Well, he absolutely fucking hates it. There's none of that ambiguity that he has with regards to theatre, having experienced it from within the belly of the beast. Yeah. When he talks about the TV actress, it's hateful, isn't it? It's absolutely hateful. And he extends that conversation to TV itself, to the writing, to the banality, to just how meaningless and empty it is as a medium. And I think it's very telling that TV is one of the very few mediums has never gone near.
Yeah, it is really interesting, and I think, although I wonder, and I'm curious as to what Barker makes of the current moment of although we may be approaching the end of it as the streaming models start to creak inevitably under their own weight. But the golden age of television that we've lived through and storytelling in the last sort of 10-15 years, and whether or not his opinion on that side of things might have changed a bit. But of course, you're right. What's fascinating to me is that although it starts off very bitchy and very excoriating about theatre, that impression is complicated wonderfully by the second act, and by the third you realise this is actually a story about the power of the potential of art to transcend mundanity, but also it's about the relationship between an ideal of art and the of necessity crude clay that has to make it, i.e. people,
right? That's exactly it. There are horror elements in this story, but it is by no means a horror story, right? Not in the classic vein, not in the way that people would understand from the 1980s. It's the undead creatures, which are they are Night of the Living Dead walking corpses. They are ghosts, they are zombies, they are undead entities, but they are not objects of horror in this story. In fact, by the end, the story seems to suggest that they are they're living their perfect unlives, because they're now being undead. They are uncomplicated by all the burdensome concerns and worries and anxieties and preoccupations of the living. They can live their art and do nothing else, which Barker seems to say in this story. What else does an artist want?
I mean, that's all true, yes, and I love the fact that the final two pages turn them into kind of heroic figures, and it is arts for art's sake. You know, there's the whole conversation about money and the conversation about stealing and the thing about no, we'll live by our wits and we'll get this done. But I want to go back to the audience, because I think what's interesting is, I mean, I saw, just as I was googling to bring up I always like to have some form of premise of the story in front of me, just because I'm terrible with names. So I was just looking for a couple of them. But one of the things that was interesting, I saw on a flick through on a Goodreads page, this story was included in a Living Dead anthology as a collection of fiction from loads of big names. It was just one of those big anthologies that came out, a few years ago. But what's interesting about that, and what you said to me, is that the audience in this, the dead audience, the undead audience, I guess technically, that we see, that's the people we see in the cut scene, right? When it cuts away, that's the only time we do that we are described in this omniscient voice. They're absolutely not zombies at all, because they're not resurrected by the promise of flesh. They are resurrected by the promise of art. They are drawn from their graves to go and attend the theatre.
And it's rapturous, right?
They applaud and they enjoy it, and then they return to their graves to gossip amongst themselves about the wonderful night they've had.
Isn't it wonderful? There's something almost like domestic and familial about it all, and it feels warm and pleasant and celebratory. I mean, I know that the crew, the actual, when the players actually see, when the cast see what's going on, they obviously panic and rush around and end up like setting fire to themselves, and all sorts chaos ensues. But by the end of it, even they, for the most part, have realized the potential of this condition.
I mean, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, there are some corpses that are left in the theatre itself that are never recovered. Of course, our aforementioned soap actress. By the way, one of the differences that you can see there immediately. So, as I said, I think that this is I think one of the things this story does is it starts with an interrogation of theatre. Ultimately, though, it is actually a celebration of theatre and the theatrical arts. That's what I meant. And that's where the 42nd Street comparison is apt. In the same way that cinema complementing musical theatre, this is actually is literature complementing theatre. That's what's going on ultimately, although it starts in that bitchy mode. But there is no redemption for the soap opera star. No. The viciousness of the final line that describes her when they find her body, and the headline in the newspaper is, soap star dies in fire, and then just a single sentence, she was forgotten within a week.
Yeah, right. He has absolute contempt for that character. This is just, isn't it?
That's beyond bitchy.
Isn't it? It's contemptuous. Really, it's absolute dismissive, contemptuous. And I think the reason it hits so hard is because it's kind of true. It's kind of true. It is also very, very mean. And actually, it's interesting to me because Barker is very rarely that mean. Very rarely, and even less so as his career goes on. It's funny.
He
softens as he ages. That's true.
And I was reflecting on a conversation you and I had recently in a different venue where we were talking about Weeworld, and we were talking about the two villains in that, Shadwell and Hobart. And even there, the thing about I mean, Shadwell is irredeemable and arguably like the villain in a Barker, because he's a money man. Obviously, his cipher in this story, his equivalent in this story, right, is it Hammersmith?
Hammersmith, brilliantly named, by the way. I mean, there's so many layers to that, right? First of all, there's like the intonations of the name. So it's hammer. It's a physical item used for building things and also for knocking people's heads off. And Smith, someone who makes something material. It's just this hard, pragmatic name, right? And also you also have the implications of the place Hammersmith, which in the 1980s,
Hammersmith Apollo, which is it's still one of the greatest music venues in the country.
Absolutely, but also, I mean, in the 1980s, Hammersmith was also like the area where a lot of underclass people lived. It was it was a place where most people had no money and they were living in terrible Thatcherite conditions. It's fascinating. I mean, you find that all the way through, actually. All the characters have very highly theatrical, like almost pun-like names in this story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. He's not holding back on that stuff. But again,
I think there's a character called Woebegone, isn't there?
There is actually
Woebegone. I mean, but that's freaking awesome. I just read that and I'm like, okay, all right.
It's a really extraordinary cameo as well, isn't it? Because he's like the director's presumably now dead mentor, right? It's a flashback, No, he pops up. He's in like a paragraph and a half, and he's got a glass eye, right? There's this really
he's this
random
detail with a glass eye who apparently was very influential and was like one of those people who, when he was in a room, you paid attention because he was so physically interesting.
Yeah, no, I love it. And he just appears for like a couple of paragraphs, gives some sage advice from presumably effectively beyond the grave, and then is seen no more. And yet what a vivid, and this is something that you and I have talked about before in many contexts, but I think it's worth reiterating here, because I consider that character to be one of the a prime example of the art of and I use this term as the highest compliment, the pulp horror writer. That I think, or even just pulp writer in general, it doesn't have to be horror genre, the ability to construct, sketch, create an incredibly vivid, memorable character over a very small number of hundreds of words. And they burn incredibly bright, and they do exactly what they need to do when they need to do it, and then bang, they're gone, you never see them again. And yet they linger. Those characters linger in the mind. Terrence Dicks was a master of it. King is a master of it. Barker is an absolute master of it.
Totally.
And here's another one, isn't it? Because he's in the story for less time than it's taken us to talk about him.
Yeah, absolutely.
But he is vivid.
Just. He takes up so little space on the page and in the story itself. I mean, he is incidental. Right. He's kind of fluff, but he's just part of the grand confection of this story, which obviously ties into its theatrical nature.
But also, I feel like, and this is speculation, I don't know, but I feel like Barker saw him and made him real and put him in the, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like
I know what you mean. Maybe he was someone like I don't know, someone in theatre, like a director or someone who did mentor Barker, because of course Barker was very green around the gills when it comes to this stuff. He didn't know what he was doing in London. He had no idea. He just did it. He's just one of those people who went and tried things. So I imagine there are quite a few mentor figures around at the time.
Yeah, I mean that may be the case, but I think for me, either way, what I'm just impressed by again is that, and this is something we see time and time again through this collection, right? It's Barker's just there's no element that gets skimped on. Like, if he includes it in the story, even if it's not there, if it's not there for a plot reason, but it's there for a necessary tone reason, and actually I think it is necessary, because the thought he delivers back to the director does change his frame of mind at a moment when he needs it to happen. And I think that does reflect the idea. But you see, this is the thing. I think part of the reason it matters is because if you think about it, it is actually also a microcosm of the entire story. This entire story is about the past of theatre reaching out to the present. It's about the way that the present moment is rippling back. That's why they're doing Shakespeare. That's why they're doing Twelfth Night in particular, because it's about the resonance of it. There is, this is something like, I haven't done theatre in a million years, but I did it at college, and there is. And I say everything I'm about to say might sound mystical. I'm as you know, not a mystical or spiritual person, so I don't mean it in those ways. But it's just the language that I have to describe it. There is a very difficult to describe feeling that is associated, that I have felt standing on a stage, reciting Shakespeare, understanding that you are speaking aloud words that have been spoken aloud thousands of times for hundreds of years, in pursuit of telling this specific story. That you are an entirely insignificant dust mote, but you are also part of a tradition. You are part of a history. You're part of something, and it obviously, for me, it speaks to me because it's not a tradition in the sense of something that I find hollow, empty, meaningless. It's in the pursuit of the telling of a story, which is one of the things that I personally find the most interesting and important things that people can do, because I'm that kind of person. So for me to feel, and again, I don't want to give a false sense that there was a sense of grandeur associated with it. I was very well aware that what we were doing was a theatre troupe, a college theatre troupe, doing their best with something that frankly very few of us, if any of us, really understood. It's not about that, but it's still unarguably true that you are enacting, you are vocalizing something that has a historical resonance. It's something that ripples behind you into the past, and will ripple forward from you way into the future, way after your dust.
Well,
There will be other people standing on these stages telling these stories using this language, and there is something resonant about that.
Yeah, well, this is how human beings have defined their cultures, and not only their cultures but their sense of self, that what they are through the ages. This is how we tell stories, right? This is the oldest form of storytelling, enacting them, oral tradition. And there is something, I mean, insofar as there is a sincere metaphysics for humanity, insofar as I'm concerned, this is it, right? This is how we feed and express our abstract selves through the sharing of stories and artistry and inspiration. And in that regard, there's a reason why there's like a mysticism or a supernatural element attributed to theatre and to production, why the superstition surrounding theatre generally. And it's because it is redolent of not only those old traditions, but what we call magic, right?
Yeah,
it's a spell. You are intoning. It's the rhythm. It's like the rhythms of a spell that you're intoning, and you are evoking something. But you're evoking something real. You're evoking emotion. You're evoking like the passions of the audience, which is far more powerful.
And I think that applies to live music as well in some ways, and that's another thing where and that's obviously again something I haven't done for a long time. But when I was a singer in a rock band, there was again, I realised now, and I hadn't put this together before, there's a similar resonance when you sing a song that has been sung many times before. When you get up on a stage in a rock band and cover a Rolling Stones song or an Iggy Pop song or something, and it's a song that has been covered by many, many people many times, and again will be covered by many people in the future, and you're part of that. But there's also something specifically again that ties theatre and live music together, and that is that when you are part of the performance, and actually also when you're part of the audience, because I've been to like 100 gigs or so in my life, and we'll go to many more, there's a moment of shared connection where I'm not someone that has the capacity to meditate. I can't I can't make my brain slow down enough to do it. But sometimes when I was singing, or sometimes when I'm at a show, I do get to a moment where I feel completely in the moment.
Yes.
Weirdly, paradoxically, I've talked all the time about these ripples through time, these echoes of the past and the future. Paradoxically, I feel most strongly when I'm in that situation, when it's working, whether I'm performing in a play or watching a play, or performing in a band or watching a band, there's an incredible feeling of nowness.
Yeah.
An incredible feeling of being fully alive in the living moment, experiencing it with incredible clarity. And again, oddly, paradoxically, part of the experience of that is a loosening of consciousness. There is a feeling of a letting go of higher order thinking, of being connecting to something deeper, something more primal, something
that's it, right? It feels like channeling, doesn't it? It feels like you are locked into something primordial and other that's working through you, like a grander engine.
I mean, the version of it I had with the band, I think the way I described it a couple of times was I mean, and I'm sure this is a cliche, I'm sure this is not an original thought, but there were times when I'd be singing a song and I'd get to the point where I couldn't remember what the next line of the song was, and I knew I didn't need to worry, because I knew when I opened my mouth it would be there.
It would just happen, right?
And it was, the feeling was as though the song was singing me, right? And it's that feeling that you're a vessel for something, you're a channel for something, and that's an illusion. It's an illusion created in the case of singing by what your brain chemistry is doing, the fact that your body is focused on channeling air in a slightly unnatural way through your body, so you're having to control that most important of functions, your breathing. You're having to regulate it in an unusual way, and then there's the compound effect of the rhythms that are around you, the incredible sound that's around you, and any feedback you're getting from the audience that's hitting your dopamine receptors and sending them. So like, this is not a mystical experience, it's a physiological one, but it still feels how it feels.
It's as close to mystical as that means anything, insofar as that means anything, right? It's as close as you're going to come.
And the thing is, it doesn't matter how well you understand that physiology, when you're experiencing it, it still feels fucking amazing.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a useful illusion, right? It's a useful illusion. And I think there's a Wildian, ironically, again, we're going back to the theatre metaphors, there's a Wildian element to it, in the sense that learning to appreciate and harness that is part of art, right? It's part of what we do. I mean, I feel that when I write a lot of the time.
Absolutely.
It doesn't feel like it's coming from inside me a lot of the time. It does feel like it's coming from somewhere else. Sometimes I don't know where the voices come from. I don't know where the characters or the images come from. I often don't, actually. And it does. I mean, Barker himself has actually described it as like he feels like whenever he creates anything, there is a hole in his head. There is some like porous element to his brain whereby some passing entity, some extra dimensional beings are pouring all of this into him.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I remember, this is I'm going a little off tangent here, but there's an equivalent. I remember that Terry Pratchett covers this in the Discords. He has a character who's a very thinly disguised Leonardo da Vinci character. Right?
Yes. What's his name?
Leonard de Quirm, I think, or something. Very much like that.
That's the one, de Quirm. That's right.
But the way Pratchett describes it is because obviously he's in the Discord, so he gets to play with making the metaphors real. He says that inspiration's a real thing, and that these beams of inspiration are like radioactivity. They're like beams. They're like beams of light. They're shooting through the universe all the time, and the vast majority of them go wasted. And then once in a while they'll hit a brain at the right moment, and that brain will light up, and then they'll invent fire or whatever, And he said, but then there are some people whose brains are, unfortunately for them, massive receptacles for inspiration, and they attract these beams, so they just get hit by them all the fucking time.
Yes.
And they can't really control it. And again,
they bend like the beams in the way that black holes bend light.
Right, exactly, that's right. Yeah, and so you end up with characters like Leonard, who just can't stop inventing things and creating things and just being. And I think that what you were saying when you were talking about Barker there just reminded me of that. It feels like a very similar sort of thing, doesn't it?
He also describes it in the inverse way as well. Interestingly, in one of the interviews, he describes it as he doesn't believe that he has the septum that most people have between the conscious and the subconscious.
Oh, that's interesting.
He doesn't believe he has it, or if he does have it, it's full of holes, and it just bubbles up all the time, and it's very, very conscious. Like his imagination is such that he sees things and he hears things in the same way that Blake did.
It's funny you say that, because every time not every time, but often when we talk about Barker, I think about there's a particular line he delivers in The Great and Secret Show, and it's a particularly impressive line as it's delivered by a gay man and what he's talking about. And the line itself is such an incendiary bit of subconscious psychology that I can never actually quite have the guts to describe the line and actually say it out loud. That's how powerful it is.
Yeah, right.
As an observation. And that's so when you say that, I have no doubt believing it, because something like that, it's one of those things you read it on the page, and I'll own it. I won't project that onto you. I read it on the page and I squirm so fucking hard.
Yeah.
So hard. And it's like, dude, that just, what are you doing, man? Come on. You didn't have to tell them about that. You really didn't.
Right. Do you find yourself doing it though when you write? Do you write stuff that comes out and you're like, what?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. On a good day. A good day. Yeah. Then you look. Yeah. When you look back and you're like, holy shit. There's. I mean, I don't read. I very, very rarely reread the novella, because I mean, I know how it sounds, but I genuinely find it too tough. But I know there's stuff that goes on in the last quarter of the Finite that is just. Yeah, I know that some stuff came out there. I know that one went deep, and there's moments in God Bomb as well. There's moments in God Bomb I have reread and gone like, well, that was sure a thing you said.
Yes,
that came from somewhere.
But I think that's when it's best. I like that so much. For me, that's when it's at its best.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's something to that. But what I love is that in this story that we're talking about, in this story about theatre, which is a form that is about that in a way that, I mean, certainly in a way that television in the 80s as the dominant form wasn't.
Well, this is another thing, right? We need to talk about the context, really, because he is commenting upon television by proxy here.
Yeah.
He seems to be talking more about theatre, but in fact he isn't. He's talking as much about the televisual landscape of the 1980s as he is about theatre as this sadly decaying, underfunded thing, underappreciated thing that only the dead attend, right?
Right.
The TV landscape, it's certainly here in the UK in the 1980s, was garbage, right?
It was pretty bad. Yeah, I mean, look, I have to say,
don't get me wrong. There's some stuff that's amazing, but by and large, it was Australian soap operas, it was British soap operas, it was American soap operas, it was Dynasty, it was Neighbours, it was Dallas, it was EastEnders, it was Coronation Street, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think EastEnders started in like 84 or 85, something like that.
Did it?
Yeah. I think.
Oh my God.
But obviously, Corrie's ancient. I mean,
Corrie's a little bit more venerable.
Corrie started in black and white. But you'd have also had, I think in the 80s, you would have had Emmerdale Farm. Brookside may have started by then.
Brookside would have started in the 1980s, yes. And Brookside is a little different, obviously, because it was the soap that marketed itself, certainly, and actually really was the deviant soap, right? It was set in a working class Liverpudlian like street, right?
Yeah, and it did just fucking go there sometimes.
Sometimes it really fucking did, didn't it? Like,
it did.
I remember it's infamous for having. This is going to age us and both like this and like just the era. It had the first lesbian kiss on television, British television, right?
Yeah,
and it was contentious. It was contentious. You still couldn't have the gay kiss. You couldn't have the gay man kiss. But that wouldn't have flown. That wouldn't have flown.
Heaven defend.
Also had an incestuous relationship, I do believe.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible.
I
mean, you know,
it's a brother-sister plot line.
But it's interesting talking about that as well, because I think, you know, if you think about that, I mean, it's one of the, it's actually one of the areas where I feel that, and again, I said earlier, like Barker Reddy is this mean and this dismissive in particular, and I don't think he's necessarily been entirely fair either about I realized for me with the soap opera form, I mean, like, okay, let's start here. You know, 80% of any form is shit. So are there shit soap operas? Of course there are. 80% of them are shit. The same way 80% of horror movies are shit, 80% of action movies are shit, 80% of any kind of movie is shit. That's not a reason to dismiss the form as a whole.
No,
it doesn't lead to my particular taste, but I will acknowledge and recognize that. I mean, you know, you start talking about in relation to Brookside, but there are examples of most of the mainstream British soaps where they actually did tackle what were burning social issues in a way that brought it home to people in a way that those people might not otherwise have had a chance to have exposure to. I know that, you know, EastEnders ran a long story with a character living with HIV, and again, that was in the 80s.
It did. Coronation Street, like in the 1990s, had a trans character,
right? And that
was trans woman, Hayley, and Hayley. The way she was marketed was fantastic.
Yeah,
it was with all understanding and all dignity, and the nation. I mean, it shows you how far we've fallen here.
Yeah.
Okay, it really does, because she was a fan favorite. People loved her.
Yeah, she was. I mean, the thing that's fascinating about her is actually they did it so well. She wasn't even a controversial figure. Obviously, she got attacked because there's always
the controversy was the bigotry.
Yeah, exactly.
That was the controversy. But her existence, she even got married, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and the attacks that did come out. That's the point. Is that the attacks were seen as fringe. Yes. You know, they were absolutely not mainstream voices. They were fringe voices, and they sounded like lunatics. And it's really dispiriting to be now in 2023 hear those exact same arguments that were part of a lunatic fringe now being, you know, espoused by members of Parliament from the party of government, and indeed in some cases the party of Her Majesty's opposition. I mean, that's just
yes.
I mean, we have gone backwards on that social issue.
Hugely.
There's no question. So again, just to say that, and it's interesting as well, because these are concerns that would have spoken directly to Barker's own positionality. And indeed, you know, the stuff that we're talking about here, those not seeing those things expressed in art is part of what Barker was railing against.
Exactly that. I mean, you have to take into account the 1980s landscape. Things, and back then the soap operas existed to reinforce social norms and establishment norms. At that, there was very little that was deviant or transgressive. I mean, that only really started to happen like in the 1990s.
Yeah, and I think you're probably right about that. And it's interesting. I wonder if Barker had written this story even maybe 4 or 5 years later, after we'd seen, for example, you know, the stories in EastEnders where you had HIV and gay male characters living in relationships and being just part of it. Whether it might have become more nuanced, but of course when he wrote it, it was Crossroads, it was Coronation Street. and it was fucking Dallas. I mean,
Dallas and Dynasty. Yes.
Now there's
He's mean, isn't it? I mean, like Diane Duvall, the character in this, he makes her. He's not just mean to her by proxy. So through his characters, even the one that she's sleeping with, by the way, Calloway, who is kind of the protagonist in a way.
Yeah.
Even he dismisses her. I mean, she's just a good blowjob, right? That's it.
Yeah, and it's very interesting actually, because I mean, Calloway is awful.
He's a horrible
awful man. And there is that nice moment when he does have the confrontation with Litchfield, and Litchfield's like, I mean, I get that she's beautiful, mate, but really, really, the leading lady. And I mean, of course, what's interesting about it is in Litchfield's case, it's almost like he's more annoyed about the cliche of it than he is about the morality.
It's not really the morality of it at all, is it? Let's be honest.
Well, let's put it in religious terms. Like the morality of it, like the director sleeping with the leading lady, that's a venal sin. But the fact that it's also a cliche is what makes it a mortal sin.
That's what makes it a mortal sin. Yeah, it's the aesthetic appreciation of it. Isn't it? He finds it tacky. He finds it's a sort of Hannibal Lecter approach to things, right? It's not about morality, it's about aesthetics.
But it makes perfect sense for Litchfield, given that he's almost the personification of theatre in some ways, or the theatre actor, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. In every respect, in his over-enunciation, his eloquence, the way he manifests, like from stage left, it's amazing. I mean, this character shouldn't work, right?
Oh, he's great. I mean, the other one I really loved was the theatrical self-depreciation. There's the wonderful line about, like, how could you tell? When the guys, have you ever been an actor? How could you tell? Which is, and the thing is, like, like I'm sure, like I have been around actors, and that is exactly that, especially British actors, English actors. That is how they behave. There is always that. They behave, there's this extraordinary, like, it's simultaneously showing off and self-depreciating, and the self-depreciation is done in such an elegant way that it's part of the showing off. Absolutely. And there's always a twinkle in the eye, and of course that has all kinds of connotations and connections to the wider kind of the kind of tradition of camp, and the way
Litchfield is camp, right? It's I mean, there is a reference. I think it could be Calloway, or it could be Hammersmith says that he's surprised there's a heterosexual bone in his body.
That's exactly it. Yeah, I think it is Hammersmith who thinks it, and it's when because he introduces his wife, right? It's the leading lady, and that's such a exactly.
Constantia. I mean, for God's sake. I mean, it's like, what?
But again, don't you feel that that's all of a piece? And this is what we keep coming back to, is the way that Barker, everything is in service of what he's trying to do with the story. The names are part of the joke. Again, the names are that same, they have that same camp, twinkly, knowing, self-depreciating wink to the audience, quality to them that the character does. It's wonderful.
A strange story for this collection, right? Isn't it strange? Like I've only really appreciated it with this read through, to be honest, how odd this story is, and when you've got its positionality just after Pig Blood Blues.
Well, and just before, which I haven't read yet, but I understand is the legendary In the Hills to Seas, right?
Oh my God! Is that the next one? Bloody hell! Oh my God! Why? Okay, right.
So that's a weird. I mean, you could argue that's actually just an inherently tough spot. You could argue that almost any story is going to suffer from those surroundings. But what I find interesting is when I take it in isolation. And by the way, what we're describing here is a minority opinion, because when I was on Goodreads glancing through the reviews and I saw that this story had been included in that collection, there's a very small number of reviews just of this story from that collection, and they're just not very, people didn't like it. It's 3 stars.
Yeah. It's not the most well remembered or recognized of the books of blood.
Yeah, and that's fair enough. I mean, interestingly, I think I can certainly describe it as less memorable, because I realized when I read it today, I thought I was reading it for the first time, and I realized I had read it before, but I could remember very little about it. So it doesn't stick in the mind the way some of the other ones do. It doesn't have that level of resonance, maybe. But you know what? I think there's a real wealth of stuff going on under the hood of this one. I think,
definitely.
I also think there's an incredible amount of craft packed into it, and I think maybe part of it is I mean, the names is a good example, actually, of something where if you take a surface reading of it, it could be something that put you off. Actually, it is the kind of thing that normally puts me off. I have a kind of little pet hate for names that are signifiers. I really don't. It annoys me when I pick names for characters, I'll do the mental equivalent and flick through a phone book because I don't want the names to resonate, because they don't.
You don't want them to be like Dickensian.
It's not how it works. It's not, you just get given a fucking name and you go through your life, unless you choose it, and that then becomes a whole story in and of itself, and that's fine. But most people do not have names that resonate with them because they're not. They're just the names they got fucking given.
They're just the name they got given. Yeah,
and that's the kind of story I'm trying to tell. But in this context, it's so clear that Barker is employing that device to signal to the audience. It's just yet another button for him to push that says, this is about theatre. This is about play in both sense of the word. This is about play in its wider sense. This is, he's cluing you in. This is about theatre, but it's also theatrical in the way it's written. It's almost like the theatre itself is a stage or is a series of sets. That's why I was checking to see if it ever cut away, and it only does once very briefly for a bit of scene setting. And if you were doing it as a play, you'd have that done as a monologue to audience in front. You'd have a narrator come out, right? And it is a narrator. You can picture a curtain coming down, the narrator standing in front of it reading that passage out, while behind him the hands are frantically rearranging things for the final act. So it could almost be a piece of theatre, the theatre itself being a set. So there's a kind of meta thing going on. It's like that farce Noises Off, which is all set, or a lot of it's set backstage at a farce in a theatre. So you're in a theatre watching a farce being performed in a theatre.
It's so odd. It's almost Brechtian, isn't it? Like absolutely. I mean, there is a commentary on Brechtian theatre in this story, but directly he talks about Brechtian theatre at one point. But the story is almost Brechtian in that it breaks the bounds of the stage, right? But it breaks the bounds of story as well. It's I've never seen him write like this before.
But again, when he breaks the bounds of the stage, he does it in a almost self-consciously theatrical way. And again, that's not an accident. That none of this. And I'm not saying he planned every word, but I'm saying he was very, very, very in tune with what he's trying to achieve with this story, as he has been with every fucking story.
It's very in control, isn't it? For a writer of his general, I mean, a bit of a pun, but callowness at this point, it's so in control. It's so conscious of what it's doing. I mean, even like the opening sequence, which is a really lurid sex scene. I mean, for the time as well. For the time and for horror. I mean, obviously horror has this patina of having lurid sex scenes alongside the lurid violence. In literature at this time, it's generally not that true, actually. They seem to be lurid sex scenes, but they're not. Very often they are something else. They are like preludes to violence, or they are parts of the violence. That's not the case here.
No, I mean, that's an interesting thing to pick up on as well, because it's also, there is, I mean, let's be real, in the 80s, following the King, what I think of as the King boom of the late 70s, the market was flooded with horror paperbacks, and there were some, whatever you want to call it, trashy, exploitative, there were, and I don't know, the timing would be interesting to think about and have a look. At what point was the Sean Herbert stuff kind of taking the James Herbert model and turning up to 11 with all of the sex and violence? When was Lehman hitting his heyday? I think Lehman might have been later. He might have been 90s, so you might be right about that. But it's interesting, if it's not happening when Barker's writing this, it's certainly in the air. It's about to happen, and it's almost like Barker is either hitting the zeitgeist or even maybe anticipating it with that.
I think he might be.
But again, even with that scene, what's so hilarious about it is, I mean, it's 2 pages of the leading lady giving the director a blowjob. That's the first, basically the first 2 pages of this story. But look at how the prose is, in the entire way through, is winking at the audience, is making these jokes, dropping in these stage related references that play it out like it. And it, I mean, I'm not, if you read it and you find it erotic, I'm not yucking your yum, fine. It's not unsexy exactly, but it's not primarily it's certainly not pornographic.
No, it's not. It's lurid. It's lurid. It really, the language is overt, right? It tells you exactly what the act is.
It's explicit and it's detailed, but interestingly, it's also really funny.
It's really funny, and there are layers to the politics that are happening here that Barker sort of inserts between the lines. I mean, it's not even like it's not even that sexual. That's the oddest thing.
No.
Calloway doesn't really give two shits. It's just something to do during this performance, right? To get something out of what is otherwise a really sorry endeavor.
I mean, there is that. I think there's also a kind of very, actually, if you think about it, Barker's got a very jaundiced, although I think, in some cases, probably fairly accurate kind of negative view of the heterosexual male. Then again, I mean, this is something you and I've recently talked about in a different conversation. But there is a thing about how Barker's actually very good, I think, at writing heterosexual characters and heterosexual sex. And one of the ways is that he understands, as a gay man, he understands the male sex drive, and he's able to do what he needs to do to apply that to a straight guy. And it works very well. So I think his kind of, as you say, pun unintended, but his callousness, their characters kind of, that's all there. That's kind of baked in. I mean, it's baked into the situation, really. There's something inherently, there's a gross power dynamic at play.
Yes, very much so.
And again, we've got to remember this was written somewhere, what was it, 82 to 84, wherever it was written. We're talking 3 decades before Me Too, but this could be the opening of a Me Too story. That power dynamic, and it's actors, or it's theatre, not Hollywood, but the principles are the same, actually.
There is almost like a meta commentary on misogyny within the arts at this point, right?
There is, although actually that's the other place where I think that Barker's kind of youth, plays a little, because I also think, although there is arguably a commentary there, I'm not convinced that Diane herself actually escapes entirely from misogynistic tropes herself.
No, definitely not. No, I mean, the author, the prose hates her. Really, really hates her. It has nothing good to say about her. I mean, at one point it does make her like an anti-Semite, doesn't it? She has there's a moment where she talks about her agent, I believe.
It is, yeah. Well, we're led to assume that's who she's talking. It must be with context as the kind of and just references his Jewishness in a very kind of
dismissive and denigrating way.
And it is anti-Semitic because it's in the context of money, especially. So it's really kind of, it's pretty unpleasant, and it's one of those things where it's a very efficient piece of writing because it's a throwaway line, but it gives you all the detail. Equally as striking, though, is the scene where she comes back from the dead, and having come back from the dead, she decides that actually her purpose, her function, is just to keep sucking dick.
And the way he utilizes the function of being undead is so it's like, okay, that's Barker.
And isn't there part of you that wonders, reading it this time, there was part of me that wondered, so Clive, did you start with the idea of, hang on, what would it be like to get a blowjob from a corpse that doesn't have to breathe? And did you just reverse engineer this entire fucking story just so you can write that? You can tell us, Clive. It's okay. We won't judge.
There's a feeling that might be the case, or he just wanted. You get the impression that I'm just going to do this.
Oh God, it's so, because there's a thing that King talks about, where he talks about horror writers talking to other horror writers, and they talk about this thing that you're not supposed to talk about, where when you wrote that really, really gruesome, horrible, horrific, were you grinning when you wrote that? Yeah, me too. And I can see Barker's grin in 82 as he writes that scene.
Because in the 80s, that would have been incendiary, right?
Oh man,
even in horror, that would have been incendiary. You've got an undead woman. And it's the realization, right? It's his realization that she's not breathing. That's why she's giving such a good blowjob, right? Because she doesn't pause for breath. Yeah. And B, he's enjoying it.
And what's hilarious is the realization that he's enjoying it causes him to stop enjoying it.
Yeah, right.
I love the paradox of that. Like suddenly he's got limp dick because he's like, oh no, I can't enjoy that.
And then as a result of that scene, you get the absolute farcical comedy of him attacking Hammersmith.
Yeah.
Where he's naked from the waist down. And it's the most ridiculous thing, but brilliant.
And that's interesting too, though, isn't it? Because it's that's one of those things where, Calloway is, as I say, not, I think, a terribly sympathetic character. And it's interesting where Barker gives him a lot of interiority. And he certainly gives him to a certain extent, reasons for his patheticness, but he doesn't shy away from the fact that he's fundamentally a pathetic man.
Yeah.
But all of that said, you take someone like Calloway, who is, who's abusing his position of privilege to take sexual advantage of an actress. That's a really disgusting thing to do. And yeah, the relationship is complicated because she is also in a position of power in some ways because of her background. So it's not as exposed.
Right. It's her star quality, right? That
yeah. So there's layers to it. It's weird. And then there's a weird sidebar about Hammersmith just being in love, apparently genuinely in love, like romantic love.
Being in romantic love with Diane Duvall.
What? I mean, what?
And also being a defeated actor.
Yeah. It's almost one layer too many, actually. Although I like it because I mean, what that feels for me is like it's almost like. And again, I'm not saying this is how it happened. I'm just describing the way it feels when you read it. It's almost like Barker going like, "Oh shit! Actually, this guy actually does have to be a real functioning human being." Let me think about this for a minute. Who is this guy? Why? Because it's reversing. Why? Why does this guy end up where he is? And Barker comes up with this wonderfully plausible, like, he tried to be an actor and he was shit, and he tried to be a playwright and he was shit. So he works as a guy who does the books because he's good at it, and at least it keeps him near the stage. But then you think about like what poison would that be for the soul if you wanted to be an artist and the best you could do is be the money man? And then you think, well, of course, that's why he's 8 drinks in to the opening night and sat in his office bitching to himself about the applause from the audience because he's just, it's that. I mean, that what worse cancer for the soul could there be than that?
What is it he calls the people who actually are in theatre? He calls them butterflies,
right? Like here today, gone tomorrow. And
yes, brilliant for a day.
Yeah, but also think about the interesting nature of that, because on a surface level, there's not a more apt metaphor for theatre than the butterfly. All of this effort and work that goes in, the 3 months of rehearsals that represent the kind of pupa stage where you eat 3 times your own body weight in leaves, and then you go into this and the rehearsals are this closed circuit where you're desperately trying to make this magical thing fucking happen. And rehearsals are hard, they are tough, and they do fuck you up. And that is. That's.
Oh, I know. I've been in the midst of them. I've seen the tantrums, and I've seen it. Believe me.
Yeah. And then, if you're lucky, if it's not, to keep with the butterfly metaphor, if you're not stillborn, if you don't never come out of the cocoon, then there is this moment of transcendence, and it is fleeting because you have your run of. You do your 1 night or your week or your 2 weeks, or, if you're really going for your 3 months, your 6 months, but you're never going to do any longer than that. Even if the play continues, you're not in the cast because they rotate people out. Right. So you get your run, and that's your butterfly stage. And then it is over. But
it's over. Yeah.
But except what Barker is telling us in this story, what the whole point of this story is to say, no, actually, no. You are part of a tradition that started before you, will continue after you. You are one small link in a gigantic chain of human experience. And actually, there's a life after death quality to this. There is an immortality.
There's an immortality to it, right?
And what I love is
it's better to be that way, right?
Yeah.
That's the other implication of the story.
And by the end,
it's the living people. Right? The people who are living distracted, blunted, banal lives that you want to feel sorry for. It's not the undead who happen to go on and are able to live their art without distraction.
And that's why the soap opera makes sense. That's why he's so angry about the soap opera in this particular context, because for him, in this moment, the soap opera represents the pornographic corruption of art.
Yeah.
Whereas theatre is the real thing. And the theatre is being ignored. And again, he's not even because necessarily people don't want to go; they can't fucking afford to.
That's it, right?
He's canny enough not to blame the audience for their choice.
Contextually, I mean, this is a very Thatcherite story, right?
Yes, of course it is. Yeah,
it's a very Thatcherite story. We're seeing as conservative governments generally tend to do the leeching and deliberate destruction of the arts.
Yeah, it's a full bore assault on the arts always.
Yeah.
Well, because I had this thought the other day, and I can't remember exactly what triggered it. I think it was something around, and I don't want to go into it because apart from anything else, it's a tangent, and also it'll date the recording horribly. But let's just there was some things going on about some reporting relating to a certain ex-member of Pink Floyd and aspects of his live show, and I don't want
that's an entirely other podcast.
I do not want to open up that. I mean, you and I have talked about Floyd anyway in the past, so I mean, people want to hear what I think about either Dark Side of the Moon or indeed The Wall. They can go and listen to the show we did together, or they can read one of my essays from My Life in Horror on Pink Floyd's The Wall, and they can get an understanding of how I feel about that. I don't want to rehash that argument at all. But the reason I brought it up was because in response to that, at some point talking to a friend of mine, I said, it's starting to feel like fiction is actually the only venue we have left in which it's possible to tell the truth.
Yeah.
And then I thought, and maybe that's always been the case.
And that's the point, right? That's why the right don't like fiction or the arts, because their ideology can't stand up to truth.
And that's why in '82 Barker's so furious about soap operas, because soap operas are at that point, at that historical moment, and again, as we've discussed, that will change, but in that historical moment they are by and large vehicles for and propaganda arms of the status quo.
Absolutely. And
in '82 the status quo is the enemy of art,
and of everything Barker is, right? I mean, Barker's always had this thing where he basically raises two fingers to that particularly conservative state of mind that says that you have to have a profession, you have to live in this way, you have to live according to orthodoxy, right? Art is something you do for frippery, it's a hobby, it's something you do over on the side. He's like, no, fuck that. No. You live it.
Yeah.
You live it. Even if you have to go through the doldrums to get there, you live it. Otherwise, don't bother.
I mean, the interesting thing is, again, as you say about those closing two pages, the dead that choose to embrace the theatre as their form and choose to embrace art as a way of life, they are eternal. But the cost is also they have to reject materialism fairly explicitly. They have to live by their wits. They are fed or not by the whim of their audience and how well they entertain. Interestingly, in that sense, thinking of another podcast strand that we're involved with, arguably they're sharing a very similar space to the Path of the Outlaw.
Yes.
People think about the romanticism of the Path of the Outlaw as saying you're someone that breaks the law. It means something much more profound than that. It's not that you break the law, it's that you are choosing to live outside of the law. And what that means is you have no protection from it, and it is inimicably hostile to you.
Yes.
And
you're setting yourself up in opposition to,
Now, that doesn't, of course, reflect either way on what your morality is in that situation. It doesn't make you either a good or a bad person morally. That will depend on, guess what, the things you do. That's the only thing that ever defines someone's morality, is what they actually do in the world. But it is an aspect of that word that I think is misunderstood by many people. And I feel that there is an element of that, because they're not just players, they're traveling players.
They're travelers, right? They're transient. They've abandoned materialism. They've abandoned domesticity. They have thrown aside society to live their art.
And it makes me think very much, it evokes for me, and I don't know if the timescale works for this, I think it probably doesn't, but the echo I got was thinking about Richard Dreyfuss's amazing turn in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead as the leader of the troupe in that, because Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, actually another play in that case, or the movie version of a movie about theatre. Obviously it's about it's Waiting for Godot, but what if Waiting for Godot was Rosencrantz and Guildenstern from Hamlet, and we're seeing backstage at Hamlet. So that's, I've just spoiled Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. No, I haven't. You still enjoy it.
Not entirely. No.
That's not the point, really. Of the that's just that's the premise. But Dreyfus plays a travelling player in that, and it's the players that put on the play in Hamlet. It's the ones who put on the play for the king that gets them all in terrible trouble because it's Hamlet playing mind games with the king. But of course, what's lovely about that is, by meeting those characters before that scene, you see them as people and you see the toughness of their lives, and what they're trying to do. And it's exactly, the speech that Dreyfus gives in that, although it's delivered in a more kind of a broader and more comedic, and also actually in some ways a nastier, more vicious way when Dreyfus delivers it in there, a more cynical way. There's definitely echoes of that in these last two pages for Barker, in that sense of because what I love about it is, I was going to say he doesn't romanticize it. That's complete nonsense. He does romanticize it because
Totally,
because he's in love with it. He's absolutely in love with theatre, and he's in love with the notion of art for art's sake.
Yep.
But what he's not is naive about it.
Yes, because he
about
wouldn't
the
be,
toughness of it.
Given his, given what he's experiencing at the time of writing,
that's the thing I love about it. There's a raw fucking courage here, because this is not some guy sitting on his millions in his ivory tower writing a story saying, "Oh, you see, but commit to art for art's sake and it'll work out." This is a guy at that level. He is on the ground. He is scrapping. He is bleeding. He is starving. He is, the
most under of the underclass, right? In every aspect of his life, like in terms of his living situation, his sexuality, his relationships,
materially marginalized, socially marginalized. Like he's there on the edge. And he didn't. I mean, this is the thing about Barker as well. That's talking about the life of the outlaw, but he didn't choose that. It chose him. He was forced into that marginality, but he does not reject his own marginalized status, and he does not attempt to subvert who he is to make himself fit into that wider prescription. He says, all right, yeah, fuck you, that's who I am.
Absolutely, yeah. He's like, no, you know what? I mean, I don't care. Let these systems starve me. Let them grind me down. I don't fucking care.
Yeah.
I'm living how I want to live. I'm operating how I want to operate. And I'm imagining what I want to fucking imagine. And that's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the end of it. There has always been, it seems like, throughout his existence and certainly throughout his creative life, this strain of fuck youism.
Yeah, and I am heartened beyond measure that he never appears to have lost that, no matter how successful he was. And he has been a very successful artist. I mean, more successful than he could have predicted or imagined. I imagine when he was writing these stories,
because it happened overnight, right?
Yeah. But I think that's what I love about it. I love it precisely because it's a love note. Because normally when you read a love note to starving artists, they're written by millionaire artists.
Yes.
And they might be millionaires who were once starving artists. Sometimes they will be, but there is always still that layer of like, yeah, it's easy for you to say follow your fucking dreams, mate.
Exactly.
You've made it already. But what I love about this one is it says, no, follow your dreams and you'll probably be fucking hungry and it's still worth it because at least you're not one of them.
Right, because that's the point, right? You are not doing this for Apollo, you're doing this for Dionysus, right? That's the whole point, You're not doing it to be comfortable, you're not doing it for the material rewards that come. You're doing it because it's its own purpose. Art is its own argument, beauty is its own argument. And as cynical as it is, so is pleasure. And that is something Barker's very aware of, right? You don't need a wider argument. It's something that, ironically, it comes up all the time in like the independent horror scene. You see arguments about this all the bloody time on social media, like the inclusion of sex and sexuality, and it doesn't need a point.
Yeah,
it's its own point.
Yeah, absolutely. And that line about pleasure is very interesting because it does bring me back round to the character of Diane and the interesting moment about her coming back from the dead and deciding, because there's a dichotomy that is expressed, I think, by Calloway initially on her behalf, really, but that she embraces, like, you can choose carnality or you can choose art. Now that's really interesting because that is, to put it mildly, not a division that Barker will consider an enforceable one in subsequent works of his.
In fact, he will invert that later. He'll invert it completely.
Time again, and in what I describe, and I don't mean it as a form of criticism, but simply as a form of physical description, in his doorstop fantasy horror novels of the 80s, his masterpiece doorstop fantasy novels of the 80s, sex and art are indivisibly bound together.
Absolutely. I mean, look at the sex scenes in Weave World. I mean, Jericho and Susanna.
Well, and in Magica. I mean, sex is central to the way the magic of Imagica works, and the central female character in Imagica, her enormous power comes in part from her, from her expression of her sexuality. Yeah. So like and it's interesting. It almost feels like a germ, an infection of the old school small c conservatism sneaking in here. Absolutely. Early work, because I don't think Barker will. I mean, I don't know. I haven't read the rest of the books of Blood. I don't think Barker will ever be this sex negative again.
No. No, there's a story later on, The Age of Desire, and whether
Right.
it's an interesting one.
Mm.
That politically, it's very interesting. Let's put it that way. We'll
Sure.
get to it when we get to it. But no, he won't be this sex negative ever again. I don't think. In fact, later on, it happens within the span of the Books of Blood. It's going to sort of invert itself again.
Okay, and that's and sure, and we'll see when we get there. But I think also it's interesting. Like, I mean, and look, it could be that it could be partly expressing an inherent kind of disgust on his part at aspects of heterosexuality which are entirely worthy of disgust. The toxic masculinity, the exploitation, the politics, the sexual politics of that.
Because I do know that he finds the commingling of sex and politics to be grotesque. He finds that politics is unworthy of sex.
Absolutely, and
it's a pollutant.
And I think he'll find far better and more elegant ways of expressing that as he goes. I mean, again, in Magica, I think could almost be amongst other things, it could be a PhD thesis on that. Actually, and if you think about, is it Judith is the main character, the female character we meet first?
Yeah.
You think about her arc in terms of through that lens, and he goes all the way on that. He goes all the way on that, and he leads her through it, and she leads us through it, and it's incredible. So, or maybe I'm misreading this, and maybe he doesn't intend any of that, and maybe the intention actually was for Diane to be a sympathetic character, and we were meant to think, no, Diane's problem is that she lives in a capitalist structure that sees her beauty and therefore pushes her into this role of being a screen actress and being successful. And actually, that's not what makes her happy.
Right, yeah. It's not what she is, right? So as a result, she is set up to fail because of her prescribed beauty. And
that makes sense of the physical relationship, because there is this thing about, we talked earlier about the power dynamic, but I did start to say it is complicated, because actually she is far more, if you think about it, she's far more powerful than the director, actually. There's no reason for her to feel she needs to sleep with the director, because she's the star.
She's the one that's propping up the whole performance, right?
Exactly.
She's the only reason that it's occurring. I mean, Hammersmith, obviously, when she's hospitalized, shuts down the performance.
Exactly. And here's a sentence I didn't think I might be saying at the start of this, although I probably should have done. If you think about, again, the political but also like the sexual power dynamic around the act of fellatio, which is where we start, the blowjob. Now that, I think she's on her knees. I think she's on her knees in front of him. Now that is, right. There's all kinds of, I don't think I need to articulate, but you can see there's symbolisms around that in terms of power dynamics, in terms of, supplication, receiving. I mean, if you really want to go there, I guess there's a kind of pseudo-religious, if you think about it.
I mean,
but I don't think Barker's particularly going down that route there.
Not in this instance, moment, but he probably will later.
Probably will if I know Clive. Yeah, he's probably got that waiting for us somewhere down the line. But I think that, but there's a really interesting moment in the description, because he's describing her doing it as though she's an actress playing a part.
Yeah.
But then there's a moment where there's a detail when he actually says she can't really like it that much, can she?
Right. And of course, when she quote unquote dies and is resurrected, and when the resurrected characters come back in this story, they come back as like purer versions of themselves. They realize what they're for, or what they want from existence. And when she comes back, she has thrown away all of the prescriptions that have been heaped upon her. Yeah. So, her onus to be an actress, which she never was, she doesn't care about that. She's never cared about that. She's been pushed into that. The thing that she likes is carnality. She likes pleasure, right? And that's kind of, that is oddly revolutionary, right?
See, that's the thing, and knowing Barker's work as I do, which is obviously less well than you, I'm inclined towards that reading of it. I'm inclined towards saying that's what he was probably reaching for, and therefore this may be a rare example in the man's early work where he doesn't quite have the chops to pull that off yet.
I think you're probably right. There is a conflict, isn't there, with the way the prose describes her, because it's positively bitchy.
Yeah,
it's not just the way the other characters refer to her because she's so bad at what she does. The prose itself talks about her in denigrating terms.
Yeah.
But the framing of her is more sympathetic. And that requires a little bit more work to uncover.
Yeah, and I think it's telling that we never get really any glimpse at all of her. Oh, no, that's not true. We do get a glimpse of her interiority. But the one scene where we do, now that's really interesting. The one scene where we do, she expresses herself entirely and explicitly in theatrical terms.
Yeah, she does.
And it is theatrical, not television.
Yeah, that's right.
Because she talks about stage positioning and she talks about entrances and exits, and these are not, I mean, they happen in television, but they're not the modes of television acting. Right. If you were thinking as a television actress, you would not be thinking in those terms. So what does that mean? Is she trying to project herself from a television actress into the role of a theatre actress? Or is that, what is going on with that?
Is that just like the generalized language of the story?
Exactly. Or is that Barker who's fallen in love with that mode and is just turning it up to 11 on this particular scene? I also think it's inexorably tangled with the thing that we've now discussed at length about Barker's clear, at this moment in time, distaste for soap opera as a form. If she's the avatar for that, she almost can't be sympathetic. She almost can't be a really fully rounded human, because
he can't really get past that, can he?
Exactly.
It's too in-baked, you know, and it is hateful. I mean, the language he uses is absolutely hateful.
But the thing is, what's interesting is he will get past that as a writer. He will get better at that, because when he later writes, for example, Shadwell in Weaveworld, who is, I mean, so far, certainly in the work I've read, the most hateful of any Barker character. Clearly, like I mean, this is the guy who created the Hell Priest, and still Shadwell is the personification of evil.
I think you're probably going to struggle to find anyone that is more. The only other character I can think of isn't really a character; he's more of a phenomenon, and that would be Hapexamendios.
Right.
In Imagica, the Authority, but he's more of a. But he's more iconic, isn't he?
Kind of a god. So
yes,
that's a little bit.
It's not quite the same. It's not quite the same, is it?
No.
I mean, in many respects, Hapexamendios is not a character. He's a massive archetype, right? He's a big bag of ideas and concepts into which Barker has shoveled everything that he hates. Shadwell is a character who embodies what he hates.
Right, but the point is that even with all of that, Shadwell still has interiority. He still has a voice. He still has motivation. He still has a thought process, and we are privileged to see it through Barker's writing, and we understand. I mean, that's the glory of that. You know, he takes even his most hated character, even his most hateful character, evil figure. We understand him. We understand how he works. We understand it, and Barker understands. And maybe that's just a maturity thing in the writing. Maybe that's because he's caught between these two different modes, where because he's tuned into this particular bitchy voice, which is magnificent, and this and theatrical because it fits the theme of the story, and he gives over to that rather than give her a chance at some real interiority there.
He takes some pleasure in it too, doesn't he? I mean, I feel that the story really takes pleasure in just being mean to this woman, to this character. It's very unusual for Barker in that regard. I mean, the whole structure and style of this story is different from everything else in the Books of Blood.
Yeah, I mean, I think that so far every story has felt different from the one that's gone before as well. Though. I mean, I think part of what is clear to me is that this is I don't know if this is the reason he decided to start with short stories or not, but this just, to go back to what you're saying earlier, this feels like a product of a man with a brain that just has, if there is such a thing, too many fucking ideas in it.
Oh yeah.
And they're all screaming for attention. They're all desperate to get out into the world. And he's just kind of, you can almost you almost feel like the reason they're short stories is because he just didn't have time to make the novels, because he's just got to keep fucking going. Because it's like the next three are like piled up behind it, like the marks on the body at the start, the framing device. It's almost like that's kind of him, right?
There's a magpie quality to him, isn't there? Like flitting from one thing to the next, one idea to the next. I mean, he's so eloquent with it as well. He expresses them so bloody well.
And that magpie quality is in the story. That's where the thing that we discussed several times now, which happens again here. It's not head hopping, but it's scene hopping. We follow Calloway. We think he's our point of view character with third person close, and then we're with the we're with this woman and we're learning about her, and then we're meeting these other people, and it starts flipping back and forth.
This one does it quite a lot, actually. There's the moment where it flips to, is it Tallulah?
That's right. That's what I was thinking. Well, that's the first time it happens.
Front of house lady.
That's right, because he says goodbye to Tallulah and walks out, and again she takes over. And at that point, I thought, okay, so that's because the theatre is the boundary of the story.
Yes, so you can't have someone walk out and then be part of the story.
And actually, it felt cinematic. I pictured it as, you see him walk out the door, and then the camera turns to Tallulah and follows her, and the camera stays inside the theatre, and maybe that would work. Again, as I said earlier, apart from there is that one breakout, but again, the breakout, even there, that's part of that Magpie quality, right? That's just like, oh fuck it, I need to do this, so I'm just going to do it.
And he just does it, right? It just keeps happening all the way through. I mean, there's that moment where Calloway basically dies at one point, and suddenly you're with the people on the stage.
Yeah. But I think the thing about that is what I feel, and again, this is the pattern I'm starting to see emerge now, this many stories in, is that it feels like ultimately, Barker will not be constrained by convention if he realizes that there's what I'm trying to say is the story, I think, the narrative will always be king for Barker. It will always be the most important thing. And if it's because this is a very stylistic story, actually, the way he uses theatrical language throughout, the way it's held inside the theatre for the length of time it is, I don't think any of that's accidental. I think he's building a premise, but then he hits a point where it's like, okay, so if I'm going to keep to this style, I'm really going to have to. I have no idea how I get these audience of dead bodies in there in a way that makes sense. Okay, so fuck it, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to cut away. Yeah. Suddenly we're in the cemetery. Hey, meet all these people, and he goes full authorial voice. He goes full omniscience. And isn't that those two from the thing with the whatever?
To the point where he's naming them and giving you like their backgrounds and their conditions as well, like the conditions of the corpses and whatnot.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a specific line where he says, I think he says, and isn't that X and Y?
Right. As though you're supposed to be part of the company, as though you're familiar with them, right?
What's fascinating about that is I was reading a Ramsey Campbell short story collection recently. It's a more recent one, actually, By the Light of the Skull, but I know he does this because I read Demons by Daylight as well, which uses he doesn't do it I don't want to say this is something Campbell does all the time by any means, but one of the many rhetorical tricks or prose tricks he's got in his toolbox is he will use a question sometimes in a way that builds tension or builds dread. There's I can't remember the situation, but there's a line where the woman says he's not here, and then the character who hears the line says, and why did that sound like a threat?
Yes.
And it just builds this layer of unease, and so forth. And it felt like that to me. It felt like that, although actually Barker's impact is more comedic than tension building.
It really is in this one, right?
It is, but it still felt like a tip of the hat to Campbell there. It felt like a kind of structurally it just had that kind of it's not the same, but it echoes, it rhymes,
it does. And again, it's part of the theatricality of the story, isn't it? It's it's a slight wink at the audience, isn't it? It's like, know what's going on.
Yeah, no, I love that.
Because that's very hard to do, right? That can really kill a story, can't it?
Oh God, I mean, this is the thing about this stuff. The reason that these rules exist is not because you can't break them, but because you really have to know what you're fucking doing when you do, if you're going to stick the landing. And many more people try than succeed.
It's true. It's absolutely true. And I think with Barker, what makes it work is just that fearlessness. It's just like, it doesn't. I don't care. I'm not going to be self-conscious about this. This is just what's happening. This is just what works.
Because actually, that spirit that finally comes to the fore in the last 2 pages is the spirit that infuses the entire story and actually the entire collection so far. And it is that. It's this art for art's sake.
Exactly that. And it's kind of surprising in this one, isn't it? It almost comes as a shock or a twist almost that is the import of the story, because given the tones of its opening and almost from much of its runtime, you'd expect it to be a more cynical story.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting is, and I wanted to get into this before we wrap up, because it was the other resonance I saw with other works or later works of Barker. When you read the descriptions, especially the early descriptions of Litchfield, I don't know about you, but I saw very strong echoes of my old friend Rictus. in those
Oh
descriptions.
yes, there is something like a child character, like a children's book character, or like a comic book character. He's out of place in this story, and he's out of time, right? He feels like an anachronism, or like someone who slipped in from some other reality, which obviously he kind of is, and yet simultaneously belongs more arguably than anyone.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there's also that sense of, I mean, just in the physical descriptions, it's the hat and the grin and that fixed face. So, of course, we, as we learn, it's because it is in fact a mask. He's actually wearing.
I mean, well, you even get the Phantom of the Opera moment, which it is, isn't it? It's Lon Chaney, right? It's the Phantom of the Opera when she peels the mask away.
Hey, man, look, steal from the best. Do you know what I mean?
Right,
like, come on. Especially
if
you're doing, like, the whole point of the story is about the theatrical tradition. Theatre steals all the time. It steals from itself. It's inherently cannibalistic, right? Like, let's not pretend. No, I love that. I love that because again, for me, that's yet another turn and wink to the audience, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And it's so
the fourth wall,
It's nearly too much.
Yeah.
Because you almost question, well, why is she doing that? Yeah. But she even says, "Let's see what you look like." It's like, all right.
No. But it's expressed in the prose because she slipped into that mode. She's playing a character. She's playing a part, and she even says, "This is an unmasking scene." Like, she's finally worked out the purpose of the moment.
That's right, because she talks about it up till that point in role. She even is afraid at one moment. She says, "Is this going to be a rape scene?" Right?
Yeah. God.
It's like, wow. I mean, of course, Litchfield is just not that hostile a character.
No, but it's interesting. I mean, what that displays of, that's the little, the little insight we get into Duval's interiority psychology, and it's a fucking mess. I mean, what is that even like? What's going on there?
There's narcissism there. There's all sorts of things going on.
But also, I mean, it is the one bit arguably that doesn't work, right? Because the interiority there firmly suggests to the reader that this woman is so transfixed by the notion of her position as actress that it inhabits her every single thought,
which doesn't.
Which doesn't make any sense at all. When she goes back to the den, she's like, actually, turns out I just like
I just don't care. Yeah, I just don't give a shit. Yeah, absolutely.
Again, like, to be crystal clear, I am not being sex negative. If you like dick for whatever reason,
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I think if this character had occurred later in Barker's career, she'd have survived. She'd have been much more sympathetic and stronger.
She might have been the hero. I mean, exactly.
She might have been.
But it's just, and so it doesn't. So there is that inconsistent. But again, you can see how, and I think it's forgivable because for me, it's like he's in love with the moment. He's in love with that, and it is awesome when she goes, "Oh, it's an unmasking scene," because it's great. Like, I figured out my part. This is my role. This is what I'm supposed to do now. And the fact that the implication of it being this, that she is entirely, completely, irrevocably divorced, removed from reality. Like, she's totally in her own psychological bubble.
It's a brilliant way of playing a scene like that, actually, because it removes you from having to play with reality, so you don't have to muck about with like realistic reactions, and which can be burdensome to this kind of story.
And it also hammers home the theme of the story. The theme, like nothing is new in theatre, nothing's new under the sun, nothing's new in narrative. Everything's been done before. It's all about like what kind of scene are we playing, what kind of thing happens next, what do we do? I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? You think about it, like she's expressing her anxieties as an actress, but you can look at it through another lens. Those are the anxieties of the storyteller.
Absolutely,
like what beat am I trying to hit? What's happening here? Especially, if we accept the likelihood that Barker is an intuitive storyteller, he doesn't fucking know. Like, it's almost like you're running through it. Like, is this a rape scene? Is
it right? Where is it going? Where is we going to go?
Subconscious into it, And then you kind of think, well, okay, so whatever else is going on here, this is fucking clever stuff. This is someone digging deep, and he's trying to work, and again, I feel like, I mean, I think this character, it's the first time I've discovered a character in any of these stories that I felt doesn't quite add up to me, doesn't feel quite like the complete package. But in service of all the other stuff he's trying to do in the story, you can see how
why she is the way she is, and the service that she performs within the story.
Right.
And it's a cleverer story, isn't it? It's a much cleverer story than I think people give it credit for. There's more going on here. It doesn't have like the impact of like your Rawhead Rexes or your Midnight Meat Trains, or certainly not of In the Hills, the Cities. But there's stuff here.
Yeah, and I also think like fundamentally, again, like Yattering Jack, which is the other one we talked about in somewhat similar terms. I think maybe it doesn't have as much impact simply because it's like at its core, for me, it's fun.
Yeah, right. It's odd, isn't it? It's a strange story. It is really, really fun and has this breeziness to it, despite the tone of cynicism and bitchiness that comes through sometimes. There is a breeziness to it. There's I don't know, there's like a lightness, the way it skips along, the way the prose just carries you through, the theatricality of it. It does feel lighter than a lot of the others, certainly than, say, Pig Blood Blues, which precedes it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I don't know, maybe that's just a fact of human psychology. Maybe things that are, no matter how brilliantly done, maybe things that are fun, primarily fun, don't have as much impact and lasting kind of resonance as stuff that is more shocking,
maybe
more
that's
subversive, maybe it's nothing more complicated than that.
Maybe that is it.
I don't think there's any issue with quality here at all. I really don't. I'm sorry. I mean, aside from what we've discussed about that particular character, about Diane Duval, who is not well served by the narrative, I think other than that, and frankly, if we're talking about 80s horror and female characters not being well served by the narrative,
well,
you know, I think even if this were the only story Barker had written, he'd still be ahead of the fucking curve compared to what most of his contemporaries were managing. So
yeah, because at least she is a character, right? At least she has something which the vast majority don't.
And he does have the excuse of being a gay man writing about a heterosexual woman. So it's not like, you know, what was the other guy's excuses? Do you know what I mean? Like, doesn't really, and again, as we've discussed, he will go on to write female characters with, you know, female characters with heterosexual tendencies far better and with more
interiority. Oh my god, well, I mean, we haven't even gone there yet, but a story which, funnily enough, is almost like a derivation of this one, where he's talking about in the same way that in this one he's talking about his experiences of theatre, of independent theatre. Later on he'll write Cold Heart Canyon, of course, which is his excoriation of Hollywood. He's from the inside. And again, female characters actually are the protagonists in that one and the main antagonist. So yeah. I mean, I'm sure we'll get to it eventually. I'm sure we will.
No, I'm looking forward to it. But yeah, I mean, I
think, and if you want bitchy, oh my god, I think Cold Heart Canyon's his meanest story in existence.
Yeah, no, you have sold me on it several times over. I just need to find some more hours in the day so I can get it read.
Oh, it's an excoriation. I mean, it absolutely is. It's so mean spirited, but brilliant in that, you know.
Yeah, and I think what again, just to kind of, I guess, to end up back where we started, really, for me, what I like about Sex, Death, and Starshine, it starts out as an apparent kind of excoriation of theatre, but by the end it's very clear actually it's not. It's a celebration, it's a love note, and it's a Barkerian love note, so that means it's clear-eyed about the failures, about the shortcomings, but I think it's fundamentally about the artistic process of attempting, you know, any artistic process of attempting to turn the lead of humanity into the gold of creativity.
Exactly that. It's not just about theatre, it's about any creative endeavor. It's about, because that, for Barker, that's where we are at our highest, right? We are our best selves when we are experiencing inspiration and or pleasure, which to him are kind of the same thing. There is a sincere overlap there. That's when we experience our highest selves, and it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter like what form it takes. It's only that you pursue it, that you experience it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But my God, yes, as you mentioned, the next one,
and I haven't read it as time of recording, so I'm looking forward to that.
In the Hills, the Cities, the one that everyone wants us to do, the one that everyone wants to do with us.
Right. We've got like, I mean, it'd be an interesting thing, is it? We've certainly got one guest lined up, but I think we had like 2 or 3 other people who wanted to come in. So
others definitely cited In the Hills, the Cities. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the one that I'm quite surprised, actually. I would have said the ones that people would want to do would be stuff like Rawhead Rex, the Midnight Meat Train, definitely, which is another quite subscribed one. A lot of people do want to come and talk to us about that.
Yeah.
But no, this is definitely the one that people have asked for the most. In the Hills.
And it's great.
By a country mile, right?
And what I love about that is that for me, I'm going in completely I know nothing about it beyond the title.
Wow. Nothing at all.
Not a damn thing.
Oh my God! Wow.
People have been but it's lovely because people talk about it, but all they do is just name it and then say wow a lot. Like nobody goes any deeper. So
that's pretty much it. When you've read it, see if you can find. There is a collection of comics based on the Books of Blood called Tapping the Vein.
Okay.
It's very, very good indeed. See if you can find the version of In the Hills, the Cities, because it is absolutely superb.
All right, I'll look out for that. And obviously, we'll be talking about it soon. So
yeah, very soon indeed. Well, thanks so much, Kit. As per usual, it's always a blast. Again, anything that you'd like to pimp out while you're here?
I mean, just the usual, I think. So if you've enjoyed hearing me talk and you want to hear more podcasts, obviously this YouTube channel that you're listening to this on is the place to do that. If you want to get hold of my written work, whether fiction or non-fiction, I've got several books out now. Your best bet is just to go to Amazon and put my name in under books. You'll find my author page there where I have all my books listed. Most of my ebooks are Amazon exclusive, so you can just buy them for your Kindle. But if you want to pick up the paperbacks, please do take the ISBN numbers either to your local independent bookshop or chain bookshop, or even go to the independent publishers where they're selling them through their own sites. Because the more you can support those people, the better. Definitely. And if you want to get something new from me every week for as little as $1 a month, patreon.com/kitpower. Often you'll get podcast recordings that get released either early or as Patreon exclusives. Sometimes you'll get non-fiction essays, reviews of works, or glimpses of whatever fiction project I'm currently working on. So again, $1 a month gets you something new every week. Patreon.com/kitpower. That's me.
Excellent. Links to all of that below, as per usual, ladies and gents. As for me, find me knocking about here on Exaggerated Elegy, where there's all sorts going on at the moment. Playing Resident Evil 4, the remake, which is lots of fun. Again, Bloodborne for the 4th time. Yeah, still going on with that one. You can find links to all of my published work, my short story collections, over at strangeplaygrounds.com. Currently doing the My Life in Horror series over at Ginger Nuts of Horror, which is continuing apace. There's lots of articles to be released very, very soon, including one taking a look at the Hannibal franchise and my early experiences of that. So check that one out. And if you fancy chatting, come over to Twitter, the Enigmatic Elegy channel, and I'm sure we can have a bit of a natter. Well, Kit, thank you, as per usual. These chats are fantastic. They're so much fun.
No, thank you, man. I mean, I'm having such a ball with this this collection. So
it is wonderful, isn't it? It's so much fun to do. And thank you guys for listening along with us. Until next time, bye-bye.
Bye.